We have grown familiar with the name Watchers, the angels assigned to guard, oversee, and watch over humanity from above. In the Book of Enoch, they appear as powerful yet tragic beings. They saw the beauty of earthly women. They craved to experience humanity. They loved, they fell, and then they gave birth to hybrid beings, the Nephilim, giants who disrupted the divine order on earth. It is a story both mythical and sorrowful, alluring and haunting, and because of that, it has captivated millions, both believers and skeptics alike. But is that the whole story? There is another book, lesser known and almost never preached from the church pulpit, yet it was cited by the very angels in the Qumran caves. This book did not come from visions like Enoch's, but was delivered by an angel directly to Moses on Mount Sinai, the Book of Jubilees. And in Jubilees, the story of the Watchers is told, not like we've known it. It's not about angels who fell in love with mortals. It's not a supernatural romance. It is a calculated rebellion, a deliberate rejection of the covenant, an intentional intervention that disrupted the ordained order between heaven and earth. So what is the truth? Were the Watchers victims of emotion or deliberate rebels seeking to become gods on earth? Was Enoch a witness or merely shown what he was allowed to see without the full explanation? And could it be that Jubilees, dry in tone, filled with timelines and laws, is the very book that helps us decode the very first fracture in the divine order? The question is not just about angels. It's this: if even angels can betray the covenant, what then sustains it? Perhaps it is not in the heavens above, but in a book long hidden, and in a person reading it right now. You. There are books, not burned, not banned, but forgotten. Not because they are false, but because they do not fit the theological mold. Not suitable for the platform, not convenient to preach, and so they are silenced. Jubilees is one of those books. While Enoch is quoted across the internet, in documentaries, in YouTube videos with millions of views, Jubilees is rarely mentioned, not because it's less important, but because it doesn't tell the story in a palatable way. It has no overwhelming visions, no strange creatures, no thunderous voices from the heavens. Jubilees speaks quietly, like a record. But within that quiet, it holds something that Enoch does not: divine order. Enoch tells as someone taken up, eyes opened, seeing the layers of heaven, seeing the Watchers imprisoned, seeing Uriel, seeing fire and majestic images of the future. But Jubilees, it records. It documents the years, the months, the days. It notes who kept the covenant, who broke it, and who was chosen to carry it forward. Most importantly, Jubilees doesn't come from prophetic imagination. It was whispered by an angel, manifested in the tent to Moses during 40 days and nights on Sinai, not for the crowds, not for public proclamation, but to be recorded like a hidden journal of the covenant. We often ask, why does Genesis say so little about the Watchers? Why just a few lines? Why is there no deeper explanation? Perhaps because the fuller text once existed, but was never read from the pulpit. Not because it wasn't sacred, but because it was too sacred, to the point that reading it would require us to reread our entire belief. Jubilees doesn't tell a story to entertain. It tells it to remind, not what we want to hear, but what we need to remember. Perhaps that's why it was folded away, waiting for the thirsty to seek it out. And if you're still listening now, maybe you are that seeker. Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. That's it. About what is considered one of the most shocking events in sacred history, the fall of the sons of God and the birth of the Nephilim, the giants. 4 verses, no names, no details, no explanation, no mention of watchers, no description of who they were, where they came from, or why they did what they did. No account of the consequences, aside from a quiet statement that God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth. Why then would an event of such magnitude be told as if it were a footnote? Why would a chapter that could open up an entire theological universe feel like a brief, cryptic glance over the shoulder? Enoch doesn't do that. Jubilees doesn't do that. Both books dedicate many chapters, many images, much explanation to clarify who the Watchers were, what they did, and why everything afterward descended into chaos, from war, sorcery, to the disruption of life's order, leading ultimately to the Great Flood. But Genesis does not. Could it be that the writer of Genesis assumed the reader already knew something, or that they intentionally passed over it to avoid opening something that the era wasn't ready to receive? Or maybe for another reason, that when the Hebrew scriptures were redacted in the 6th century BCE after the Babylonian exile, the scribes had to make choices to keep what was safe, understandable, and capable of guiding the public faith. And the parts too mystical, too hard to verify, too overwhelming for a young religion trying to define itself, were left out. Not because they weren't sacred, but because they were too sacred to fit into a story that needed stability. Genesis kept the frame, but removed the mystical core inside. Enoch and Jubilees are the uncarved records. And if you've ever felt something missing, brushed over, or blurred in the early verses of Scripture, it's not your imagination. That gap is real, and the hidden scrolls are waiting for you to fill it. Enoch is one of the most mysterious figures in all of Scripture. He did not die. He was not buried. He was not forgotten. Instead, Genesis says, Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. From that point, generations have seen Enoch as the symbol of righteousness, a man who understood the heavens, one so trusted by God that he was taken without passing through death. And the Book of Enoch, the writing that bears his name, reinforces that image, a man taken to see things beyond human understanding. In that book, Enoch is led by angels. He is taken through the skies, through the layers of the cosmos, shown the storehouses of light, the furnace of judgment, and most notably, he sees the Watchers, the angels who were once sent to earth, but who fell. Enoch portrays them as lovers, not betrayers. They didn't come to cause chaos, but because they couldn't resist the compassion they felt for the daughters of men. Yes, they sinned, but as if they too were victims of the very tenderness and weakness God once gave to mankind. A sad story, a beautiful story, a tragic story. But is it the whole truth? Jubilees tells it differently. No love, no weakness, no sympathy. Only one thing. The Watchers knew the command and willfully broke it. They weren't led by emotion. They weren't tempted. They chose to step outside the order, to become gods on earth. They didn't just sin, they betrayed the covenant. And that difference forces us to ask, was Enoch, the one who saw, truly the one who understood? Or was he simply the first to write it down, from the perspective of an astonished witness standing outside, missing the whole picture? and Jubilees. It may very well be the explanation Enoch never had the chance to hear. Perhaps some are not taken up into the heavens, but are given words that angels only speak once the witnessing is over. And sometimes the one who sees is not greater than the one who is told. If you place the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees side by side, the first thing you will feel is not their similarity, but a theological fracture. Both speak of the same event. Angels, the Watchers, abandoned their sacred station and came to dwell among humans. Both mention the union between them and earthly women. Both acknowledge the outcome, a generation of hybrid, giant beings who destroyed the order of mankind. But the way they tell the story and how they interpret it is completely different. In Enoch, you read a dazzling account. Angels portrayed as ancient teachers who taught humans metallurgy, astronomy, jewelry, warfare, and sorcery. They loved mortal women. They gave knowledge never before known, as if they were trying to share what they held. Their error, then, is an emotional one, a love that crossed boundaries but was deeply human. In Jubilees, you find no romance, no love, no sympathy, only violation, only betrayal of divine command, only consequences, analyzed clearly, generation by generation. Who broke the law, which law was broken, and what outcome lingered into the ages that followed. Enoch tells in symbols through supernatural visions. Jubilees writes like a legal indictment, with evidence, testimony, and a full framework of divine reference. And from here, a deeper question begins to form. If you only read Enoch, you may feel sympathy. You may view the Watchers as those who misstepped because they drew too near to the light of mankind. You will see a tragedy. But if you read Jubilees, you will see that this was no accident. It was a rebellion against the covenant, a deliberate act with clear consequences, the disruption of sacred time, the breaking of divine law, and the opening of a pathway through which humanity would forget the first commandments. And in that moment, you realize these are not just two accounts. They are two perspectives on the nature of the fall. One sees it as the weakness of emotion, the other as the willful act of rebellion. And the question most worth asking is not, who is right, but which narrative does your faith rely on? In the Book of Enoch, we once saw the Watchers as curious beings, angels who looked down upon the earth, drawn by the beauty of human women, and who fell because their emotions exceeded sacred boundaries. They were not allowed to love, but they did. They were not permitted to remain, but they made families, had children, taught, and in doing so, lost their divine purpose. But Jubilees does not tell it that way. In Jubilees, there is no mention that they descended out of love, no word of being led by emotion. On the contrary, their mission is made very clear. They were angels sent to teach mankind righteousness, to observe, to uphold sacred order on earth. They were not outsiders. They were representatives of heaven. They carried divine assignments. They had offices. They were Watchers, placed exactly where they were needed to preserve the covenant between God and mankind. And for that reason, their failure was not a simple slip in the name of love. It was insubordination. It was betrayal of a command. The Watchers didn't merely err. They twisted the very mission they were given. They did not oversee humanity. They sought to dominate it. They did not guide humans to live by the law. They taught them how to break it more efficiently. They did not preserve order. They crowned themselves as gods. and in doing so, they betrayed not only God, but the very foundation of their existence. Thus, Jubilees offers no sympathy, no sorrowful tone like Enoch, no angelic tragedy, only a record. They were sent, they rebelled, and the consequences will echo throughout the generations. A more terrifying question follows. If beings so divine, assigned to keep order, could betray their mission, then what structure is strong enough to endure? The Watchers did not fall because they loved too much. They fell because they believed they could decide in place of God. And if betrayal can come from the chosen ones, then what will preserve the covenant? Perhaps not the one lifted up, but the one who still remembers the command. We often view the fall of the Watchers as an individual moral failing. Angels loving mortals, breaking a rule, fathering Nephilim, and being punished as a result. It's a simple view, relatable, sympathetic, and easy to overlook the real nature of the problem. Because if it were only a moral violation, why would the consequence be so catastrophic that God would choose to wipe out all of humanity in the Great Flood? Jubilees gives us a different explanation, a perspective that does not focus on behavior, but on structure. An angel is not merely a being, they are a link in the chain that connects heaven's order to earth. When they are sent, they bring precision, authority, and the oversight of the heavenly court. They represent the covenant. So when a watcher steps out of that position, the consequence is not a private sin. It is the shattering of the connection between heaven and earth. They did not simply marry, they recklessly transferred sacred knowledge, teaching humanity to forge weapons, practice magic, manipulate life, seduce through cosmetics, and divine destinies through stars. What should have remained in holy realms was dragged down, distorted, and turned into tools of lust and war. Order was disrupted, not just in the human heart, but in the fabric of the universe. The sacred was secularized. The divine laws were replaced by ambition. The cycles of time, once tied to covenant and holy days, began to drift from their path. Jubilees makes it clear this is not merely a story of morality, but of structural upheaval. When the law-keepers become the lawbreakers, when the guardians become the violators, the entire sacred ecosystem collapses like a domino chain. And more frightening is this: the distortion did not stay in the past. It flowed from generation to generation, from angel to giant, from giant to man, from man to time itself. A stream of deviation, very real, winding its way through history. If you've ever felt the world today slipping away quietly from what is sacred, perhaps it all began in that moment, when the covenant stopped being kept and became something to exploit, and order wasn't lost in war, it was lost in forgetfulness. In Enoch, we enter a world of visions, where everything is seen, described, recorded with overwhelming detail. Enoch is lifted into the heavens, sees the unending light, the unnamed creatures, the regions of judgment, the angels bound, the gates of wind, the sacred flames, and thousands of revelations beyond reason. He is a witness, a man who sees and reports. But Enoch does not analyze, he does not evaluate, he does not sequence cause and effect. He gives no timelines, identifies no individual responsibility, no detailed legal transgression. He sees and testifies. Jubilees is different. Jubilees does not take you through the heavens. It does not leave you lost in metaphor. Instead, it leads you step by step, with timestamps, legal segments, and historical structure. It doesn't tell what was seen. It records what happened in order, by function, by consequence. Who begat whom? How many years after Adam? In which season? In which week of which cycle? More than that, it records clearly which law was given, who kept it, who broke it, and what happened next. If Enoch is a camera, capturing everything he passes by with divine fidelity, then Jubilees is a formal indictment. It does not merely say this happened, it says why it happened, who is at fault, and what must be done to prevent it from happening again. This is not the opposition of poetry and law. It is the contrast between witnessing and processing sacred memory. One is personal experience in reverence and awe. The other is divine architecture, systematized to prevent forgetting. And the question is, what do you need more right now? A magnificent vision, or a map to trace the severed path of the covenant? Enoch shows us what was lost. Jubilees tells us why it was lost. And only when we hold both together do we understand. It is not enough to see. We must remember. It is not enough to bear witness. We must measure and restore the order that was set from the beginning. When an angel falls, our first thought is often horror, betrayal, and lost power. But there is a deeper question, quieter, rarely asked. When angels can no longer keep the law, who will? If those sent to observe are the first to break the covenant, then who will re-establish divine order? Enoch tells us of desolation. The watchers are bound, the Nephilim are destroyed, the earth is cursed, the great flood is prepared. But then Enoch disappears. No one remains to see. No one remains to record. No one remains to guard. Jubilees continues. It does not leave the world in emptiness. On the contrary, it records very clearly each generation, each act, each child of Adam, those who, in quiet faith, still kept the law. They did not need to be taken to heaven. They did not need to see the heavenly realms. They only knew one thing: the covenant must be preserved. Adam, after being cast from the garden, still taught his children the Sabbath, offered sacrifices, and built an altar in the dry land. Seth, who replaced Abel, was not just a son, but a continuer of memory. Enoch, in whose time men began to call upon the name of the Lord, preserved the sacred name in a world forgetting. Noah did more than build an ark. He restored order, offered sacrifice after the flood, and renewed the covenant for all mankind. Jubilees names them one by one, like glowing embers, burning quietly through the theological night when angels are silent and heaven no longer answers. And that is the turning point. This is no longer the angel's story. This is the story of mankind, formed from dust, but able to keep divine law when even radiant beings could not. If the watchers, those from above, can betray, then there is no reason to think that man is too weak. Jubilees does not glorify mankind as divine, but it hands back to humanity the responsibility of memory, not to rule, but to keep the fire. And if you are still reading this, perhaps you too are holding a small glowing ember, something that should have been forgotten, but still burns, waiting to be kindled again by a promise once written in a scroll long overlooked. In popular memory, Noah is the survivor, the builder of the great ark, the one who led every pair of living creatures to safety, the man who endured the great flood and witnessed the world reborn from the wreckage. But that is only a small part of his true portrait, and Jubilees, the book few mention, redraws the missing part. In Jubilees, Noah didn't just build the ark. He rebuilt the altar the moment his feet touched dry ground. He didn't wait for a command. He didn't wait for a sign. His first step was to offer a sacrifice, not to celebrate survival, but to remember the sacred covenant that had been broken. Then he did what Enoch never did. He made a new covenant with God on behalf of the rest of humanity. A vow, not from a weak man begging for mercy, but from someone who understood deeply his role in preserving the cosmic order. Noah in Jubilees is not a character who luckily escaped. He is the chosen, not because of strength, not because of merit, but because he remembered the law, remembered the order, remembered God, not as an abstract concept, but as a covenant that must be upheld day by day, generation by generation. And when angels failed, when radiant beings betrayed their command, when heaven no longer spoke aloud, Noah, a human, stood in the silence and kept the flame. Not with miracles, not with visions, but with concrete actions, building an altar, lighting fire, offering sacrifice, keeping sacred time, teaching his children. In the view of Jubilees, that is faith. Not something that lives only in feelings or abstract belief, but faith that acts, that rebuilds, even when the world has just collapsed. And so, Noah is not merely the last of an old world. He is the first of a new order, no longer dependent on angels, but rooted in human beings, flesh and blood, who know the covenant only lives if someone chooses to keep it. Have you ever seen Noah in that light? If not, try reading his story again, not through the faded memories of childhood tales, but through the eyes of someone who understands survival is not the final goal. Keeping the covenant is. We often think of time as a stream of passing days, glued to our human calendars, Monday, Tuesday, January, February. But the Book of Jubilees doesn't view time that way. To it, time is not a tool for measuring life. It is the framework of the covenant, a sacred structure established from the moment light was first named, and one that must remain intact if the universe's order is to survive. In Jubilees, time doesn't flow randomly, it turns steadily. A year, not 365 odd days, not alternating long and short months, but exactly 364 days. Divided into 4 seasons, each 91 days, corresponding to 4 spaces and 4 covenantal milestones. 3 months per season, each month 30 days, with one special added day, not to adjust, but to guide the light. Altogether, forming exactly 52 weeks. Every year always begins on the same day, the 4th day, the day God created the stars, the sun and the moon, those who measure time for humanity. It's not the calendar of Babylonian royalty, not the calendar of the Roman Empire. It doesn't orbit the moon, nor serve wars, harvests, or political decrees. It is the calendar of the covenant, a sacred calendar delivered by an angel to Moses, so that if mankind still kept it, the sanctity of the cosmos would continue to pulse in rhythm. Jubilees doesn't merely tell stories, it arranges time. It reorders every event from Adam to Noah, from Abraham to Isaac, by weeks, by seasons, by cycles, as if the sacred order can be restored just by counting correctly. And the astonishing insight is this: if angels distorted the universe's order through their actions, mankind can restore that order by living rightly within sacred time. No need for miracles, just keeping the rhythm that God set from the beginning. To measure time again is to measure the covenant. To live in sync with sacred time is to live in divine order. And if you've ever felt time slipping into meaninglessness, days repeating, years losing their way, perhaps it's not just a personal feeling. It may be a signal from a sacred order that's drifted from its divine origin. Jubilees does not invite you to perform miracles. It only asks you to begin counting again, not by the world's measures, but by the original light. Because when time is counted again, order can be restored, and maybe so can your soul. We often think of the Great Flood as the final judgment, a sweeping destruction from an angry God, a wrathful cleansing of mankind, wiping everything off the earth, ending an era of sin. But Jubilees does not tell it that way. In Jubilees, the flood is not the end. It is a purification, not to annihilate humanity, but to cut away the part that had strayed from the covenant, the part no longer capable of remembering, the part that had become so blended and distorted that it could no longer retain its original sacred shape. The fallout of the Watcher's fall was not just the Nephilim giants. It was a generation of people profoundly affected. In thought, in spirit, in time. They no longer kept the Sabbath. They no longer offered sacrifices according to the law. They turned to sorcery instead of prayer. They trusted weapons instead of righteousness. And most of all, they forgot the covenant. Therefore, the flood did not come to punish blindly. It came as a painful but necessary cleansing, like holy fire in the temple, like ritual water, to preserve what could still be saved. Noah, in the Book of Jubilees, is not just a man who was spared. He is a seed, a holy seed, still pure enough to keep the law, still awake enough to remember, still humble enough to offer sacrifice before his first meal after the flood, still faithful enough to re-establish the covenant, not just for himself, but for all who would come after. Jubilees reveals judgment does not come to end, but to preserve a Noah, to preserve a bloodline capable of restoring order, to preserve a thread of memory, enough that one day, in the shadow of generations, someone would still know how to count the holy days, keep the seasons of offering, and quietly pass down the law to their children. That is mercy, not as immediate forgiveness, but as the patient faithfulness of God toward what can yet be revived. If you have ever felt your spiritual life flooded, remember, the flood in Jubilees did not wash everything away. It preserved the part of you that was not yet lost. And perhaps you too are stepping off an ark to rebuild an altar somewhere in your very own life. We often think the covenant is written in stone tablets, in sacred books, in temples, places eternal, solemn, and unbreakable. But Jubilees tells a different story, quieter and deeper. The covenant does not live by stone or ink. It lives by memory, by people. From Adam to Seth, from Enoch to Noah, and then to Abraham. Each generation is remembered in Jubilees not just because they lived long, had children, and built homes. They are remembered because they remembered what God had commanded, remembered the holy days, remembered the offerings, remembered when to bring the first fruits, remembered which harvest to give thanks for, remembered the laws of circumcision, of purification, laws not recorded first in scrolls, but in the flow of life. Jubilees doesn't say the laws were simply given and copied into documents. It says angels taught them, then humans repeated them, then taught them to their children. And thus the covenant was preserved, not in libraries, but in spoken word, in small repeated acts, in tents, on altars, among the fields. The watchers failed not because they were weak, but because they forgot the covenant. They knew the law, but they refused it. They carried knowledge, but failed to carry memory. And their fall was not emotional. It was the severing from divine order. But mankind, though weak, though limited, though flawed, if we remember, the covenant is sustained, not by power, but by living memory. Jubilees does not call you to become a scholar, a prophet, or one lifted to the heavens. It simply asks, do you still remember? Remember the days that once felt sacred. Remember a promise once heard. Remember a silence you once called holy. If you still remember, you are the place where the covenant is stored. No need for stone tablets, no need for a temple, just one person who still carries sacred memory in a world that's forgetting. Maybe you are not the first, but perhaps you are the last who still remembers. We are often captivated by the extraordinary, by winged angels, fallen watchers, supernatural images, half radiant, half shadowed, soaring across the skies, through the heavenly realms, leaving fiery marks in our imagination. Perhaps that's why most of what we remember, what we share, what we pass down, always revolves around them, the beings who fell from high places and left behind devastation. But maybe we've remembered the wrong thing. While our eyes remain fixed on the heights, the covenant has been kept by ordinary people. With no wings, no glory, no visions, they don't fly through the heavens, they light fires, plow fields, build altars, teach their children about the holy days. Jubilees doesn't portray them as heroes. It doesn't need embellishment. It only records. Adam kept the Sabbath. Seth rebuilt the altar. Enoch called on the name of the Lord. Noah offered the first sacrifice after the flood. Abraham kept the covenant of circumcision even before the law was formally given. They didn't need to see angels because they remembered. The watchers failed not because they were too powerful, but because they forgot order. Humanity, though fragile, though flawed, can still preserve the sacred if it still remembers the law. If what fascinates us is the watchers, what we must remember are the keepers of the law. If we only retell the story of fallen angels, but not of those who quietly preserved the covenant, then we are not only forgetting history, we are surrendering our role within it, because maybe you were not taken up into heaven. You did not see the heavenly realms, but you know how to keep a promise. You know what it means to set aside a quiet day to worship. You know the trembling of your heart when you read something ancient, and it still stirs your soul. And that, in the eyes of Jubilees, is greater than any miracle, because what was forgotten was never the watchers. It was the ones who once held the flame, in the season of darkened skies. If you forget them, you are cutting yourself off from the role you were given, a role not to admire, but to continue. We often think of the sacred as strange things, miracles, manifestations, voices from the sky, radiant light piercing darkness. But the Book of Jubilees tells a completely different story. A story with no miracles, no thunder from above, only quiet people doing the right thing day after day, generation after generation. And it is precisely that keeps the covenant from vanishing. Adam, after being cast out of the Garden of Eden, did not argue, did not blame. He knew how to repent. He taught his children how to build an altar, how to offer sacrifices, how to keep the Sabbath, even when no longer near to God. In the darkness of loss, he kept the small flame of order alive. Seth did not perform miracles, but he kept the Sabbath in a world slowly forgetting what was holy. While the descendants of Cain built cities, invented technologies, chased power, Seth preserved the sacred rhythm, a proper week, a proper day of rest, a lifetime lived without breaking the beat. It may seem small, but it was the last sacred heartbeat in the midst of chaos. Enoch did not kill, did not move mountains, but he passed on the law to his children, not with books, but with words, with habits, with meals that began in offering, with prayers spoken before the harvest. And because he did so, a lineage continued, knowing the difference between what is holy and what is common. They did not work miracles, but they were the miracle of faithfulness. In a collapsing world, the sacred was not saved by battles or light from heaven. It was preserved by small altars built behind homes, meals that began with thanksgiving, fathers who taught their children how to count the days according to the Lord's rhythm. The Book of Jubilees does not record those who did great exploits. It records those who never lost step. And if today you are living in a world where the Sabbath is no longer holy, where promises are broken with ease and stillness has become a luxury, then you understand the difficulty of preserving the sacred in the most ordinary things. You don't need light from heaven, just a meal that begins in gratitude, a day set aside not to work, but to listen, a step not straying from what was once handed down. That is not a small thing. That is what keeps the world from completely breaking apart. There is a paradox left behind in Jubilees, quiet but powerful. The brightest beings fell, but the most ordinary humans kept the sacred. The Watchers were once light. They were created before man. They had no flesh to weaken, no instincts to tempt. They were closer to God than anyone had ever been. They saw glory. They heard his voice. They knew the order, but they fell, not from weakness, but from pride. Not from ignorance, but by choosing what opposed the covenant. Meanwhile, in a world losing its divine rhythm, a man still taught his children to keep the Sabbath. A wife still lit the altar fire each week. A child still learned to pray at the right time. A family without power, but with memory. Jubilees tells their story, not because they worked wonders, but because they were faithful. They did not need to be lifted into the heavens. They did not need to see angels. They just needed to remember, and that, it seems, was enough to keep the covenant alive across generations. That is the most profound reversal Jubilees offers its readers. You don't need strength to preserve divine order. You only need faithfulness. If the beings closest to God can still betray him, then humanity, with all its weakness and limitations, can still succeed. If we keep our word, our days, our hearts. You don't need to work miracles. You only need to teach your child to give thanks before a meal. You don't need to speak in tongues. You only need to know when to be silent. You don't need to build a temple. You only need to guard a portion of your week, not for work, not for spending, not for noise, but for remembrance. Because the covenant, according to Jubilees, is not found in the strong or the chosen by worldly measures or those who can fly. The covenant lives in the one who does not forget. And if you are reading these words, perhaps God is not waiting for you to ascend the heavens. He only waits for you to remember and to keep in your small home, in a quiet morning, in every act that may seem insignificant, but may be the very thing holding the order together in a forgetting world. If you're still listening now, perhaps you didn't find this video by accident. Perhaps you are not a scholar, not a priest, not someone who lives in a monastery or a temple. Perhaps you don't know Hebrew, haven't read the entire Bible, and at times still feel weary in your faith. But there is something you're doing that many generations have missed. You are remembering. You don't need to be perfect like an angel. You don't need to fly or see visions. You don't need to stand on a pulpit. You only need, like Adam, to know how to repent. Like Seth, to try to keep the holy day, even in a disordered calendar. Like Enoch, to quietly teach your children a few prayers, a few old stories. Like Noah, to rekindle a flame, even while the world around you sinks beneath symbolic waters. You don't need to change the world. You only need to keep a piece of the covenant in your private life, in a decision that doesn't follow trends, in a day you set aside just to listen, in a moment when you reject distortion, not out of fear, but because you want to preserve the holy. Jubilees is not widely accepted, but for that very reason, it belongs to those who still search quietly, not celebrated, not taught publicly, yet it holds a memory, the memory of sacred order, of right time, of a covenant not carved in stone, but carried by the living. And if anything in this journey moved your heart, perhaps that sacred code still lives in you. You don't need to be perfect. You only need not forget. Because if the angels have fallen, and mankind still keeps the flame, then perhaps you are the next part of that covenant. A piece, small, but bright enough to rekindle a forgetting generation. A promise, not shouted, but strong enough to awaken the holy in your soul. And perhaps, right where you stand, where you live, where you love, is where the covenant is waiting to be remembered. We have traveled together through two streams, one from Enoch, one from Jubilees, one filled with imagery, heavenly realms, angels, visions, one filled with structure, time, laws, responsibility. And if you ever thought you had to choose between them, then maybe you've missed the most important thing. Enoch is not wrong. He saw and he told. He is a witness, a soul lifted from the earth, beholding the fall of the watchers, the judgment and the consequences. He tells it through symbols, emotion, the splendor and terror of the divine cosmos. Jubilees does not oppose him. It doesn't seek to replace his story, but to restore the structure, to measure, to record, to systematize sacred memory. It has no heavens, but it has the sacred calendar. No thunder, but a quiet law kept through generations. And between those two currents, something rises, not division, but convergence, the covenant. Both Enoch and Jubilees, each in their own way, sound the same alarm. This world once had an order, and that order was broken. And what will save the world is not a mighty angel, but a human who still remembers what was once holy. So the question is no longer, which book is more right. But do you still remember? Remember a covenant not kept in books, but passed through the hands of a father, the fire of a mother, the footsteps of a child who pauses on the Sabbath. Enoch tells to awaken. Jubilees writes to recalibrate. One stirs the heart. One calls to action. One is the flash of light from heaven. One is the quiet ember passed through generations. Both do not cancel each other, but illuminate one another. And you, the one listening, do not need to choose a side. You only need to choose one thing. Will you keep that covenant in your own life? Because in the end, the question isn't which book is right. It's whether anyone still remembers why the covenant was given in the first place. Not all of us will see angels. Not all of us will be lifted to the heavens like Enoch. Not all of us will hear God's voice like Moses. But that does not mean the covenant has left us. The covenant, in the eyes of Jubilees, is not hidden in scrolls sealed in the caves of Qumran, not locked away in theological archives, not suspended high above, reserved for the chosen. The covenant is what you still remember and still live with each day. You may not do great things, but you still know how to keep the Sabbath, to set aside a day where you do not chase work or hurry or chaos, but pause, give thanks, and listen for the holy. You may not prophesy, but you keep your word. You do not swear, but you do what you say. You may not perform miracles, but you remain silent in sacred places. And those small things are where the covenant still lives. Jubilees does not tell stories to impress. It rewrites memory to remind us the covenant always needs someone to remember, not someone powerful, but someone faithful, not someone exalted, but someone who still sees the sacred in what seems all too ordinary. You don't need to live in the time of the patriarchs. You don't need to stand in the desert to receive a command. You only need to look back at your own life and ask, what sacred thing have I still kept? Do I still remember? Do I still believe? Am I still passing anything down to the next generation beyond knowledge, money, or skills? If the covenant is still alive, it does not live in the clouds. It lives in a meal offered with thanksgiving, in the eyes of a father, telling his child what he once heard as a boy. In the moment you place your hand on the shoulder of someone weary and sit in silence with them. No thunder, no angels, just a gentle stirring inside. Every time you encounter something sacred, still lingering, and you realize you haven't forgotten. So don't wait for a grand event to see the covenant. Perhaps you yourself are the last place where it is still preserved. If the world is slowly forgetting the sacred, then what? If the holy day has become just another weekend? If promises are reduced to signatures on contracts? If sacred laws are no longer taught, but replaced by convenience, emotion, and self-centeredness? If what once marked the soul now sits in dusty pages, dismissed as outdated, superstitious, or no longer relevant to the modern age? If everything is being erased by noise, by entertainment, by overwhelming distraction? If the scrolls hidden in Qumran are never recognized? If the covenant once carved in stone, written in fire, now remains only in the fading memory of a few, then what? Then maybe you are the last living line of code. Not because you are special, not because you are better than anyone else, but simply because you still remember. You still remember something that once was deeply sacred. Something that once turned the axis of history, not just human history, but the history of the covenant between God and creation. You still feel your heart stir when someone speaks of faithfulness. You still pause when you see a candle burning quietly in the night. You still feel your soul tremble when reading a passage about keeping the law, not from obligation, but from love and reverence. And that, according to the Book of Jubilees, is where the covenant still lives, if angels can forget, if even priests can err. If once holy communities could lose their way, then the fact that you still remember, still live by what is right, is no small thing. You may be living in an indifferent world, but you still choose to be silent in the presence of the sacred, still strive to teach your children what is right, even if no one else encourages it. Still set aside one day each week, not to work, but simply to remain with the Lord. You don't need to do anything grand. You only need not to go dark, because perhaps the sacred still lives, because you have not let it disappear. You are the last line of code, not because you were canonized, but because you have still kept yourself. And the sacred lives only in those who remember and live faithfully by what they remember. You don't need to believe me. You don't need to agree with every word in this video. You don't need to nod at every quote from Enoch or Jubilees. I am not here to convince. I am only whispering a suggestion that maybe you already knew. No theological debate is needed. No need to prove who's right or rearrange the history of angels and men. Just one very simple thing. Read again. Open Genesis again. Not as an old book, but as a living memory. Read again about Adam, about Noah, not to check details, but to feel the current of a primal covenant. Read Enoch, to hear the voice of one who saw the heavenly realms, who witnessed the collapse of divine order. And if your heart stirs even slightly, open the Book of Jubilees. Don't read it as if reading something forbidden. Don't read it like searching for a new conspiracy. Read as if you are finding something that once belonged to you. A covenant, once lived within a family, once passed from a father to a son, once preserved by a lamp that never went out, on a quiet day, without buying or selling, only sacred silence. Maybe you've never heard of the Book of Jubilees. Maybe you've thought you're not holy enough to understand such things. But if you still feel something stirring in your heart, then maybe that covenant is still waiting for you. Not to prove yourself right, not to teach others, but to remember and preserve what the world is forgetting. You don't need to follow me. You only need to follow one thing, the honest stirring in your heart when it touches something sacred. And perhaps that is the invitation, not from me, but from the one who once placed the covenant into human hands, once wrote it in memory, and now places it again into yours. After everything you've heard, who do you believe understands the Watchers more clearly? Enoch, the one lifted into the heavens, who saw the fall of angels, who described the mysterious layers of space, the supernatural scenes beyond imagination? Or Jubilees, the forgotten scroll, speaking not with visions, but with structure, not with imagery, but with law, time, and responsibility. One is a witness of what was seen and heard. The other redefines through the words given by an angel to Moses. Both are important. But who do you trust more? And more importantly, why? Share your thoughts in the comments, not to argue over right and wrong, but to piece back together the fragments of memory that are being forgotten. Because each comment is a memory retrieved, each answer a step toward remembering what once lived in Scripture and may still be waiting to live again in you. If this video stirred something in you, a vague memory, a long-lost sense of the sacred, something that made your heart tremble, then please don't keep it to yourself. Not because we want the message to go viral, not because we need more views, likes, or approval, but because each person who remembers is one piece of the covenant still alive. Share this video with someone you know, someone who has wrestled with the story of the Watchers, who has wondered about the Nephilim, who read Enoch with curiosity but never found the depth. Or simply send it to someone seeking their way back to the sacred. It might be a family member quietly rediscovering their faith, a friend who listens but doesn't yet ask, someone you're not even sure still believes but might still want to remember. Share, not to stand out. Share as a sacred act of preservation, preserving what's fading in a noisy world, the collective memory of the covenant. Because if the sacred can be forgotten, it can also be kept by something as simple as a share, a whisper, a connection, a flame passed to another before the dark can extinguish it. If you've believed that keeping the law, the Sabbath, the offerings, the sacred order began only with Moses at Sinai, then prepare to see things differently. Because in the next video we'll enter a critical moment where one man without written law still kept the entire covenant. Abraham, not just the father of many nations, not just the man who left Ur in response to a call. In the Book of Jubilees, he is the first to rebuild the altar after the days of Noah. He kept the Sabbath, taught his children the covenant of circumcision, offered sacrifices in season, all before the law of Sinai was ever given. Jubilees presents Abraham as a lamp in a time without written law, where the sacred survived only through those who remembered. In the next video, we will follow that journey, not to retell history, but to discover how one man lived the covenant before anyone taught him how. And maybe in his journey you will see a glimpse of your own, a person not assigned as a prophet, but still able to preserve the sacred in everyday life. Subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, because this journey isn't over, and the map of the covenant still has many places yet to be redrawn. Amen.